Hello and welcome back to Downtime Activities, and welcome back to our still unnamed short discussion video series, where Will and I just talk about something RPG storytelling related that is not long enough for our bonus action podcast and not helpful enough for our help action series. Somewhere in between. These are usually, 10, 20, 30-minute long conversations where we just break down an idea and give our advice and thoughts on it. Today, specifically, what we're going to be going over is how to come up with and stat new 5th edition D&D monsters the easy way, or what I would consider the easier way of going about it. There's certainly something to be said for getting to really come up with a cool monster design and take that thing and fully stat it out, start to finish, the way you want it, down to
Right.
every little detail. And that's super cool. And that's a lot of fun and very difficult to do well if balance is super important to you in your game. If you want its abilities to be on par with the party that is going up against it in a mechanical action economy damage numbers sense, you can get pretty close with just rough knowledge, but without some pretty hardcore prep and thought, it's pretty hard to do that super accurately.
Right.
But there's luckily kind of two much easier ways to do this that I do constantly. And that is reskinning and augmenting an existing stat block. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to say why this is a really valuable tool to have in your arsenal as a DM. And that is because what do you get as a gift for the person who has everything, right? What monster do you throw at the party that's already fought everything? And it's not that we've used literally every single stat block in the monster manual and Volo's guide and all those, extraneous books,
Right.
but we've played a lot of D&D as a group, and a lot of the people in our group have faced probably a majority of the statted monsters that exist that aren't epic level 20 CR plus sorts of creatures. And so it's hard to get that, oh god, what are we facing? What is this thing? How do we fight this sort of moment? And even when players are good in avoiding combining player knowledge and character knowledge and all that, it's different when you're like, oh, it's one of those, as opposed
Right.
to, oh god, what is that? And you get that excitement and that new experience for players. It's also just fun, and also it just works well if you have a specific monster or type of creatures that you want to exist that's really story specific for what you're doing, that there's not a monster that fits into that niche. There's lots of reasons to need this, but I think usually it's to have something that's weird and new and a new experience for the players to fight against where they won't know what to expect.
Well, that's part of the reason that you and I have said multiple times on the channel, as a DM, read the whole monster manual. And as a player, never look at the monster manual.
Yes, absolutely.
If you know you're never going to DM, and you're just going to play D&D, never look at the monster manual because I love having to figure that stuff out in combat and encountering stuff for the first time and coming up with a plan and then realizing partway through that it's okay, that doesn't work because it's fireproof. Uh, Plan B, whatever that is. It's fun. It's interesting. It makes every encounter, or at least the first chunk of every encounter, kind of unique. It's like walking in on a raid boss in a MMO or like a boss in Dark Souls game or something like that, or even just a new enemy in a lot of video games. And that first encounter, or the first couple encounters, is all about just figuring out what they do and what their abilities actually are. I mean, you and I ran all of or almost all of the dungeons in Elder Scrolls Online just as a two-player party, and like it turns a lot of boss fights into puzzles because it's okay, what is this ability that this boss is using? What does it actually do? How do we avoid it? How do we get through this? And that's I think especially if you're more a fan of more number crunchy RPGs, um, stuff like Pathfinder, that's how boss fights should kind of feel. It should be about figuring out what abilities do, figuring out how to stop them or avoid them, and figuring out how to use your abilities to the greatest effect. But even if that's the case, even if you never read the monster manual, it's very easy to end up feeling like you're kind of familiar with every monster. Or even, and it's not just a D&D problem. I mean, in Savage Worlds, like Yeah, you ran your Devils of the West game, and we encountered an enemy very early on that I was like, oh, I've used the stat block in every campaign I've ever run. I know what these things are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's just really a common problem for people who play tabletop RPGs regularly. And if your DM isn't regularly homebrewing monsters or homebrewing encounters, you're going to become familiar with at least the basic swaths of stuff really pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's something that's unfortunate because you want to still give those like basic regular enemies their time to shine,
Mm-hmm.
and that should still be a thing. And I think that there's a time and a place where a generic goblin stat is going to always be useful in fifth edition Dungeons and Dragons.
Absolutely.
A generic zombie stat is going to be useful, but after you fought them a couple times, you know what mechanically to expect. But if you dot in a couple of weird other types of creatures in there, even in those kind of big group encounters, one zombie that looks different, that does something different, whatever that may be, then it makes it a more involved and interesting encounter. And like I said, I think that the two major ways to stat out creatures that will not require you to put in as much work at the very least is to either reskin or augment. And I think reskin is the one we should go over first because it's the easiest. And that is you take a concept, a creature that you want, and you literally find a creature in the monster manual that is mechanically the closest resembling it, and say it's this now.
Yep.
I think an easy example of this would be if you want to have a construct enemy, maybe like a large mechanical stomping machine that has like an AOE steam attack. You could take a dragon stat block and use its breath weapon.
Mm-hmm.
Use like a low
Yep.
level one, high armor class, makes sense for a construct, makes sense for a dragon. AOE attack with a recharge makes sense for a construct, makes sense with a dragon. If you're using, a low level fire dragon, they could both do fire damage. Change the claw attacks to be bludgeoning instead and have it be these like kind of giant fists. You've got your monster. You can
Yep.
take that and then you have those exact numbers one for one. You can transfer over, and you've got a entity here that is a set challenge rating that you can use your calculator and make sure is not going to wipe the floor with your party or be at the appropriate level of what you want, in theory at least. The dice do as they will. And
There's a good reason we throw vampires at low level parties because for some reason our play group just has a long history of putting the hurt on high level vampires, even as like level 1 or 2 characters. But the nice thing about reskinning stat blocks is very few people, if anyone, honestly, knows the monster manual well enough to be like, okay, it's got this breath attack and this number of hit points, and its AC is this, which means he's just reskinned the bronze dragon wormling stat block, so we can
so I know by
you know,
that we can do this. This will be its weakest saving
right.
throw. And if there is a player who's that knowledgeable about it and plays that way, I would not want to play with that person. I mean, to each their own, but that's not the person I'd want to play with.
No. It's like you get a lot of mileage out of restatting just because, like, as soon as the packaging is different, um, everything else goes out the window. Like, you might have a rough idea of, how many hit points a dragon has, but you don't know that, like, by the stats, that's what you're fighting. So it helps to just sort of make everything new and keep everything kind of fresh. And honestly, a lot of people do this anyway, like in smaller ways. I'm a huge fan of dragons that breathe fire. Like, I don't necessarily like that I think dragons can breathe frost. I think that's cool. But I'm not necessarily always a huge fan of every dragon type in the monster manual breathing a different type of fire. So I think a lot of people do that as well. They just change the color of the dragon or the damage of the breath weapon, but leave everything else the same. Like, essentially what you're doing at that point is just reskinning an existing stat block. A lot of people do this all the time, sort of even without recognizing that that's what they're doing.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many elementally focused monsters in the monster manual that are like, behirs or whatever, the like lightning lizard snake things, or rimmerhauses, which are kind of like frost but fiery kind of giant frost bug things. It's super straightforward to take one of those, describe it differently, and change damage types and have a completely different monster. Something that is going to be really weird and interesting and the players haven't seen before, but more or less is just across the board the exact same stats, just some changed stuff. And another important thing to think about when you're doing this is you might have to adjust other parts of this stat block, kind of leaning more into the augmenting than just reskinning in terms of defenses, damage resistances, so on and so forth. Where one creature might be, resistant to an elemental type, that might not make sense for the reskin you've done, but you change it that this thing it's becoming is some sort of construct. So it has slashing, piercing, bludgeoning resistance due to its metal armoring or whatever. Whatever that
or just
would make
resistance
sense.
to non-magical damage.
Yeah, something along
is
those
an
lines.
easy thing to change.
It's something that you can just slightly adjust. And I think that usually that's the way to go, even when you are just reskinning, is to not always just do the exact one for one. Is to reskin and then augment slightly some things that don't drastically change the power level of the creature. It's a really straightforward way to make a new monster.
Well, and it's important to remember that, that at their base, like all the sort of special abilities aside, monster stat blocks in Dungeons and Dragons consist of essentially HP, AC, and movement speed. And then claw attacks or a bite attack or abilities like that. But those also tend to be kind of fall into standard pools. Most kind of beast level enemies tend to do the same types of damage using the same damage dice. More like monstrosities tend to do the same types of damage using the same damage dice. Like they kind of fall into pools, and it's very easy to just talking about modifying an existing stat block even slightly is to just raise or lower AC slightly based off of what makes sense, raise or lower movement speed, raise or lower a pool of hit points, and completely change the feel of an encounter. Because you're familiar with something that's roughly this powerful, but this thing's moving way faster than anything you've fought up to that point. All of a sudden that encounter feels at least a little unique.
And it's at least something different. There's a little bit of spice thrown in there with that. As for kind of the augmenting side of this, we've started into this now. Augmenting stat blocks is my preferred way to do it. I like to reskin and augment. I think that it's what makes for the most straightforward but still really interesting enemy. Augmentation is where you have to be thoughtful more so than with reskinning. There's a little more thought that goes into it, because when you are fundamentally changing things, it's easy to incorporate something that will fairly drastically adjust power levels of creatures. And you can do so if you're confident that adjustment won't tip the scale in an unfavorable way for what you're trying to set up with your encounter. It's just important to understand what abilities you're giving and how powerful those abilities are. And my personal opinion is that one of the best ways to make a unique enemy out of a kind of boring stat block is to make just a slightly unique version of the base stat block enemy. There's obviously goblin bosses and goblin mages and stuff that you can find stat blocks for, but it's pretty straightforward to just take one of the same stat blocks, maybe give it a little extra HP or AC or whatever, and then just give it one unique ability. And my personal opinion is literally just come up with a unique bonus action and give it to whatever enemy you want to be interesting, and statistically keep it more or less the same. And you'll have this fundamentally different seeming creature. And I would avoid that bonus action being boring. I don't want a bonus action it can make an extra attack as a bonus action. It can make an offhand attack as a bonus action. It can make a creature make a saving throw or just take some damage as a bonus action. I think giving a boss enemy or a unique enemy a bonus action ability that is unique and interesting in some sort of mechanical sense is what really makes it a unique and interesting enemy to face. Good examples of this would be it can use a bonus action, maybe. A lot of boss enemies will have some sort of ability to inspire allies. So this one has a bonus action that it can, give bonuses to allies, give free attacks to allies. Another thing can be some sort of saving throw that gives some sort of debuff to the party or to individual members of the party, so that you can see this isn't it's not just getting to deal more damage. It's doing something that's affecting us negatively, and we can try and defend ourselves against that, or make sure that whoever has that's who we're kind of interposing in the way. Something that gives, this one that's like, here's my example. There's a bunch of bandits attacking. You just use like thief and bandit stats and stuff, and you give one of them a bonus action ability to like point out the weakness. You choose one of the enemies, and then they gain vulnerability to piercing damage until that thing's next turn. That person is now target number one to get out of the fray because all these guys with their daggers are coming for them. And you don't have to then like make everybody focus them and try and deal a billion damage to that player. But if they can make that person make a save or have that, then it's like, okay, we need to focus that person down. They're able to point out these weaknesses, and that there's something along those lines. I think goes a long way in diversifying your encounters. And there's a million different mechanics in this game. There's so many different. Literally, just like look up, D&D 5e statuses or like status effects, conditions, and pick one. And pick one that's seemingly appropriately powerful. Don't just like be like, oh, this
Paralyzed.
Yeah, exactly. This CR 1/4 goblin has a bonus action, no save, paralyze. I mean, could do. It's a goblin, you just snipe him before he does it or after he does it. Go like, oh god, don't let him do that again. But just doing something like that to diversify mechanically what's happening in the combat is huge.
Mm-hmm. Well, and something that once you have an understanding of the game, and presumably if you're, at the point where you're running a game and meddling with stat blocks, you have an understanding of the game. You can just also fundamentally change, either for the sake of certain counters or certain enemy types, or even for how the world that you're building is running. You can change how, not necessarily how a mechanic works, but you can, you can make changes at sort of a deeper or broader level. I'm working on a D&D campaign world, which maybe will show up on the channel at some point. We have way too many campaign ideas. That's inspired by a blend of sort of The Witcher and Dragon Age, because really those two worlds are almost the same anyway. The Grey Wardens are just Witchers.
What? No, these are distinct ideas. How dare you?
Yeah,
My franchise.
The elves have very similar like global cultural backstories. The dwarves are very similar. I mean, it's just like they're very, very similar worlds.
Well, no, because in Dragon Age there's a kind of unbalanced and angry view towards normal people and people with magic, where the people with magic are seen as having too much power and access to do dark and twisted. Wait a second.
Yeah,
they're exactly the same.
Mages only exist within organized secret societies, and mages who exist outside of that tend to be hunted down as renegades. Anyway, but I'm, because it's meant to have that blend of The Witcher and Dragon Age, I want monster hunting to be kind of a part of that world, and I very much built a sort of Witcher or Grey Warden-esque faction around that idea. But part of the reason, or part of the prep work for that, was wanting to change how monster hunting worked. And there's the idea in The Witcher that steel is for humans, silver is for monsters. And a lot of stuff in the monster manual has resistance to non-magical damage or immunity to non-magical damage. But quite often you get around that with either, obviously if you have a magical weapon, or if you have a silvered weapon, you can get around those sort of resistance to non-magical damage. But I kind of took that a step further for the sake of this campaign prep, and made anything that's sort of classified as a monster in that sense immune to non-magical damage and resistant to silver damage. And so there is a special type of weapon that does full damage to those creatures, but it partially explains why the city guard isn't dealing with this CR 1/4 creature or this CR 1 monster that in normal D&D, the city guard could just handle this thing. But the reason they have to call in specialized monster hunters is they literally don't have the tools for the job. If something isn't truly a monster, it's beyond normal soldier's ability to deal with. So you have to go to a mage or you have to go to a monster hunter in order to solve that problem. And that's a powerful adjustment. That's a broad adjustment. Like I'm taking, whole types of creatures and adding, a new tag to their stat blocks. And but like really at its core, what it's doing is just slightly changing one of the sort of core mechanics that already existed in the game. And that's going to make every monster encounter in the game feel unique and feel new and feel different, especially, you know, before the players have broad access to the type of like specialized equipment they need to deal with that problem. And it's like kind of a drastic step, but it's warranted by the world and it's achieving that same goal. It's making encounters feel unique. It's making encounters feel new.
I think that just goes to show that understanding the world you're running in is a big part of understanding how to do this well and understanding how you can make those kind of large scale adjustments. I really quickly want to just give an example of my own doing of this, which is a big reskin augmentation version of a creature. If anyone who's watching this has watched our Skygate series, it's where it's a kind of D&D 5e game that takes place almost entirely underground. A lot of Underdark stuff. And there's some weird kind of astral influences going on in it. I'll leave it at that. One of the creatures you guys fought not too long ago was a weird hovering carapace with weird tendrils that pumped fire into people. That was a dragon, essentially. That took a young, I think it was probably brass or whatever the metallic fire dragon is. But I heavily changed the description of it, obviously, and then mechanically how it worked. But what I kept primarily was AC, hit points, the speed it could fly at, because this one was a hovering instead of flying, and its stats, its strength, dex, con. I found one that those stats made the most sense. Its saving throws, I kept pretty much the same. I might have taken one away and given another one a boost that made more sense to the mind of this creature. Skills, damage, immunities, and resistances were mostly the same. But the big thing I changed was the attacks, how they worked. So I have it up here just to look at. I won't break down the exact mechanics of it, but I essentially took its breath weapon and turned it into, instead of a broad breath weapon that hits everything in a cone, 3 different tentacle attacks that are doing a third of the damage with each of them. Mechanically, it's roughly that. The way I viewed it is, I could easily hit 3 players with this attack, so this is winding down its power level, but I also made the you get downed by this fully effect, the you get killed by this effect, much scarier. So there was kind of an ebb and flow, a give and take mechanically of how dangerous this thing was, but numbers-wise, saving throws, how difficult the saving throw was I believe the same as the breath weapon saving throw. The damage was similar, just spread out amongst these separate attacks instead of all in one cone. So that's an example of one that, like, statistically, the only thing that is really fundamentally different about this is the way and the nature it attacks. And even those, the saving throws, the bonuses, and the damage are roughly the same. It's just attacking differently and divvying that damage up differently. But the overall action economy, how many creatures it's damaging it around, how many times it's getting to hit creatures, is very, very similar. And this is a good way to take a stat block and keep it at the same power level, but make it feel entirely different. Like a giant floating space crustacean with fire pumping tentacle spikes does not sound like a dragon. That is not what a dragon is. But statistically, it was, in a lot of ways, a young dragon's stat blocks.
Well, and it's important to remember, action economy is an excellent point to bring up. Like, action economy is one of the easiest ways to unbalance a game in one direction or another. Action economy is extremely powerful. It's part of the reason why, like, summoners are annoying on the tabletop for 2 reasons. One, because it slows down combats by an immense amount, and 2, because it like heavily shifts the action economy. Honestly, like, we are almost sort of running into that problem in our Baldur's Gate 3 series on the channel. And you continue to make it worse.
Druids, man.
Because you have, and the particular druid you've built has just like pulled the action economy so far in our favor that if we get sort of the prep for a combat that you want, we go into a combat outnumbering our enemies 2 to 1, even if we're supposed to be outnumbered 2 to 1. Like it quite often we're like it just makes it difficult for enemies to move through terrain because there's so many more enemies attacking. Like we're just outputting so much more damage because we just get a chance to make so many more attacks, like just as a team. Um, Action economy is a very powerful thing, and giving creatures extra attacks or extra bonus actions or extra legendary actions or taking them away wildly swings how powerful a creature is going to be. And it's an easy way to even make a, you know, lower tier creature more dangerous and making them feel much more dangerous to the party is by giving them extra abilities that they can use each turn, giving them extra attacks, extra actions, sort of. A creature that every, like, a creature that is moving so fast that every round in combat it gets to take 2 turns back to back, even if their abilities are very mundane, is going to really feel extremely powerful and extremely annoying for the party to face. But it's an easy thing to do. Like, I'm just going to use a basic sort of non-threatening stat block, but they get to take 2 turns back to back every round in combat. The players are going to hate that guy, whoever he is.
I think that this is a good example of one way to make an enemy seem like a boss enemy or seem more interesting is to give it a bonus action that's interesting and unique. Another way is to give it a legendary action. You don't need to give it 3, and you don't need to call it a legendary action. Mechanically, copy what a legendary action is, though. And if you're, for instance, say you have a kind of early game party, first level characters, and they have to fight this like legendary warrior, like a renowned warrior in the area. Use like a veteran stat block. I think it's a CR3 creature, maybe CR2. That's that's a good challenge for its first or second level party to face. But if you have 4 or 5 well statted out second level characters going against a veteran, they'll wipe him in a round because they have so many more actions than this individual has. But if you give them one legendary action where they get to make one extra longsword attack a turn, and they take their turn, somebody else hits them, somebody else throws a spell, and then they hit the person who marked up and hit them, the players will be like, oh god, this this person just took a turn outside of their turn.
Or give him or give him a free action on his turn to make a trip attack every round.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's just something that it's like, oh, this guy is doing more than he should every round. And like, but now that's an ability we know he has, and that's something we need to keep an eye on. But it's changing that action economy. It's immediately making them a little bit more powerful and better able to match the players a little bit. And that's part of the reason that legendary actions exist, is an attempt to give big bosses the ability to kind of mirror the action economy that players have.
Yeah,
like,
they want
and layer actions are the same way.
Yeah, they 5e's creators, Wizards of the Coast, wanted there to be fights where it's one big enemy against the party. And they learned really quickly, due to action economy, that unless you give this boss multiple actions, doesn't matter how hard they hit, they can have a one turn smackdown, but then the cleric goes next, healing words as a bonus action, and then throws, casts some other thing. And then the other 3 or 4 players at the table all take their turns smacking down the guy. So you have to have this kind of shift in action economy in order to balance things out for that. It's kind of a must if you're wanting to have a single enemy be threatening to a party of at least decently high level characters, because action economy is such an important piece of all of that. A last kind of really important piece of advice for this that I think a lot of DMs will get stuck on is, remember when you are creating your own monsters using any of these kind of strategies and beyond, that you are making a monster. You are not statting out an option for the players to take as a subclass. You are not statting out a new class that players can use. You are not beholden to rules. You are the DM. You get to break the rules. That's the point. Another example of this, you guys faced a Dragonborn in Skygate who was essentially sneak attacking with a claymore. There's no way to do that. I made it a claymore that was light. It didn't use dex. It was still a strength-based claymore, but it was a lighter one. It didn't have heavy properties, but it was a. I decided that this creature had a special ability, and that ability was it's able to make stealth or make bonus action, not bonus damage on its attacks based on its level of stealth and sneaking up on people and having advantage. It functionally worked very similar to sneak attack, but he could use it with his claymore. Is that fair? No, but who cares? It's a monster. You're the DM. You don't have to say, hey, I've used the rules of sneak attack for this for the party. You just can use those, add it to this creature that you have, and make it work. It doesn't have to follow any class rules, even if it's borrowing class mechanics.
And it's also important to remember on the other side of that same coin that you are making an enemy that the players are supposed to fight.
Mm-hmm.
There's a 90% chance, probably closer to 99% chance that this enemy is going to die. Like, unless the players somehow manage to Disney power of friendship their way out of the encounter and recruit this monster, which it's player characters, who knows? They'll absolutely find a way. But it's important to remember that, like, this, you can't be too protective of this thing that you've made, because, like, you're putting it in the player's path as an obstacle, and you're expecting them to destroy that obstacle.
Yeah.
They like, and for it to truly be satisfying for them, really, they have to be able to do that.
Yes.
You can't. I think some DMs get very protective of the thing that they've made and get kind of annoyed when the fight doesn't go the way that they wanted, and player characters, sort of ruin it. You and I, in particular, in other people's campaigns, have a bad history of doing that. Whether you make an elf that's impossible to find, or a wizard so powerful it makes the god of death dance to death, or stripping character levels and powerful abilities away from
Brandon's campaign.
It was supposed to be a big scary boss fight, and you and I just kind of waltz in there and deal with it. That's what player characters do, and you can't be too defensive of them sort of breaking the thing that you made, because you have to remember, you put it there to be broken.
Yes, you didn't make this enemy to kill the party. You made this enemy so the party had something interesting to kill. That's kind of the whole point behind this. So don't get married to those stat blocks. And if you came up with a really neat ability and it never got to be used or really used, no prep is ever wasted, right? This enemy has
recycle your notes.
Yeah.
Recycle your notes. Always recycle your notes.
Always. You have a unique bonus action ability that they killed this enemy before it even uses it. You know what? He never had that ability, but you know who does? This next enemy you're about to face. That's the one who has that ability, because it's neat, and I want you to face it. I want you to overcome it and destroy that enemy. But yeah, I mean, I think that's good advice in general. Don't get married to stat blocks. And this could be a whole other video, a whole other discussion. Don't get married to NPCs. Don't get so invested into something you've come up with that you refuse to let it die. You refuse to let the players defeat it unless they defeat it in the way you were hoping or the way you expected.
Right.
You need to let it be. I mean, you guys freaking took what was supposed to be the scariest combatant in that hag fight in Skygate and made it like Three Stooges stumble its way around and laugh on the floor until you slowly beat it to death. That wasn't the way I expected that or wanted that fight to go. I wanted that thing to be this terrifying, melee threat that you guys had to avoid. And you guys made it look like an idiot. But that was hilarious and made people laugh until they cried at the table. And that's what we play these games for.
You forced a boss fight in the first D&D campaign that I ran that I didn't really want you to fight. It was a super cool NPC that you guys never even got a chance to talk to, because you decided that this was an existential threat that needed dealing with. And despite the urging from arguably another existential threat to not go down this road, you did. And a party member died. And it was a super cool, super epic fight. I'm super happy with like how all that played out, but it wasn't like I'm not so beholden to the idea of that NPC and to that character that I'm going to force some kind of weird story event to make sure that you don't actually get a chance to kill them. Like, it's not satisfying to anybody.
No.
You can't be you like, it's important to remember, as you're like, especially if you're like really putting in the effort for statting out custom creatures and statting out custom villains, or or monsters for the parties to fight that you just can't, you know, you don't feel like that stat block was wasted when the players show up and kill it, because that's why it's there.
You put that effort in. The reason you're watching a video like this is because you want to make interesting monsters for your party to fight. Part of that is killing them. Part of that is fighting and defeating those monsters. So that's why you're doing it, is for a fun experience for everybody. But I feel like if we go too far with this, that'll be a whole other video. So we should probably cut this discussion off here and maybe talk about it a different time. But kind of closing thoughts on the easy way of making a new monster for your party to fight. Reskin. What can't be one for one reskinned? Instead, augment. And you will be able to make super interesting monsters. Super interesting villains, NPCs, whatever it is. Things with stats that are not super challenging for you to make in a balanced way, but feel super distinct and weird and different from what more experienced PCs are super used to facing off against.
Right.
Any other thoughts than that to ship off with?
I think it is, maybe we should have led the video with this, but I think it is important to remember that, like, by and large, this is a conversation for DMs who have experienced players. If you're if you're a DM who's running a game for a new player, even if you're super experienced in the game and you've played a ton of it, if you're playing for new players, if you're playing with people who aren't familiar with the sort of lore and the creatures of this game, you don't necessarily need to put in that much effort. Like, if players have never fought one before, a beholder is an utterly bonkers fight. And at every turn there'll be new mechanics that they're struggling to figure out and being blindsided by. And
literally sometimes.
yeah, or paralyzed or dropped in a hole or all sorts of things. And there are so many creatures like that in the monster manual that are just like aboleths. Like, if your party has never encountered an aboleth, it doesn't even have to truly be the main combatant of a fight. It can just be a presence that is present during a fight. It teaches them a hard lesson about responding to the strange voices in their heads.
Yes.
It's in an experienced party that you're not going to get that mileage out of it. But it's important to remember that, like, what really matters in terms of statting out unique creatures is whether or not the players are going to know about them. The players are all new to the game. Like, for the most part, find the cool monsters in the monster manual that you want to use, and get your mileage out of those first before you have to go screwing around with stat blocks.
Yeah, I'm all about prep wise the lazy DM mindset, which is just like, don't do the work you don't have to do. Do the work you want to do, and do the work you need to do. And so if you, like you said, this is great advice for somebody who has that more experienced group, but feel free, especially with newer groups or groups who have only played in certain kinds of campaigns. There are so many monsters. There are so many things that exist in all these different books and stuff. You have a plethora of things to throw at them.
Oh, yeah.
But if you need something a little different, try some of this advice, and I think you'll be able to come up with something pretty cool and unique. I think that's where we'll end this little discussion. Thank you, everybody, for watching. If you enjoyed this, check out the channel. There's tons of content like this. We have, like we kind of talked about before, a podcast-style, long-form conversation with our bonus action podcast, our help action videos, which are kind of shorter, concise rules, breakdowns, and advice, as well as a ton of gameplay. We're running Skygate, which will, I think, be starting to post again, probably after this has come out. It'll be the next one of those will be coming out shortly afterwards, theoretically. By the time
that's just reminded me of an editing discussion that you and I are going to have, but
that can be off camera. But anyway, check out our other stuff. Please, if you have any other ideas for discussions like this that you'd like to see, things that you want just our potentially helpful advice on, throw that down in the comments too, and we'll definitely consider making a video on it. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Now go forth, slay dragons, sling spells, roll dice, and enjoy your downtime activities.